What's going on, everybody? This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Through Ministry, and today I am very pleased to announce that I received my copy of my new book titled Apparently the Monsters Are Real, a crash course in cryptids, monsters, and other wacky stuff by me, Joe Harper. So as I'll get a little bit closer here to the camera so you can see it. But yeah, it's pretty cool. This just came in the presses today. I just announced this on my YouTube channel this week. You'll see that the last video I made, I put out about a 2-minute trailer, which I guess you could call an announcement trailer. And then in this video, I'm just going to give a little bit more commentary on my new book, try to generate a little excitement, and tell everybody what the book is about, give a summary of it, so that everybody can know what is going on with this new book. So that's going to be the purpose of today's video. So yeah, I was pretty happy how it turned out. The cover was pretty cool. The past couple books I've written, I had others help me come up. There were other people who did a cover for me, but because of life change circumstances, it was on me to do the cover this time, and I was very happy to be able to come up with a picture. This cover, I don't know about you guys, but it makes me laugh. I have a picture of Bigfoot riding a surfboard and wearing sunglasses, and family and friends have all told me that they think the cover looks cool, or they have laughed at the cover, which has been really great. So I'm really happy how it turned out, and I decided to wear my hula shirt today because if you're gonna make a video summarizing a book which has Bigfoot on a surfboard wearing sunglasses, I think it's pretty appropriate that you should wear a hula shirt, even though it's the middle of February in Minnesota and it's about 10 degrees outside and freezing cold. All the more reason to try to keep warm by wearing some tropical apparel, and it matches the book. So that was really cool. But getting a little bit more down to business, getting a little bit more serious, and it's not on that note, it's not inappropriate for me to make a little humor because in this book I did insert a little bit of humor into the book. It's a serious book. It's a book that gives serious analysis of cryptids. And this book is intended to be an introduction, an on-ramp for people who don't know anything about cryptids, and it's written from a Genesis 6 perspective, an affirmation of what I call the Genesis 6 narrative. But even though it is, in one sense, a serious book, I injected a little bit of humor into the book at times, which is something I've never done before in a book. So I tried to make it a little bit witty, and I tried to insert a little humor because the paranormal, and you get into these subjects like cryptids, and it all ties back to things like the demons and the Nephilim, and I'll explain that all a bit more in a minute. But it can be dark subject matter, and it can be kind of depressing, and it seemed appropriate you don't want to be so humorous that it's irreverent, what the Bible calls jesting. You don't want to be just foolish and silly to the point where it's not a helpful book anymore. But I did want to lighten the mood, and that was very intentional. Sometimes when I do these very serious videos where I'm talking like this, you don't see my humor and my personality, but in social settings with friends, I do have a little bit of a witty, dry sarcasm that comes out. And I think my personality in this book shows up more than it ever has in anything else that I've written. So that's really, I think, appropriate to really summarize. And I think even the cover, you kind of see that. It's a very colorful cover. It's something that makes you smirk and makes you smile, and it's intended to really grab people's attention. But as I say in the preface of this book, because this book is about 212, it's 214 pages long. It's a much more readable book. If people know my last book I put out called The Hidden Enemies, the Antichrist, the New World Order, and the True History of the World, which was a very historical book and a kind of a political book, and it talked about things like secret societies in that book, and a very heavy, serious book, and it was a very thick book, a very big book. And so I wanted to try a different approach. I wanted something that was much more approachable. I wanted a book that was much more easily accessible to a greater range of people. Even though the subject matter of cryptids is still very fringe, I tried to write it in a way and even present it in a way where it's much more easily accessible to the public. And I wanted a book that was easier to read. I wanted a book that is entertaining to read as much as you can with this type of subject matter. I wanted something, it's a 200-page book. It's a lot slimmer than my last book, and it's a lot more approachable. And all of that is intentional. And this book, like I said, as it covers cryptids, I have 11 chapters in this book, and I cover about 8 different creatures, and I cover some other concepts as well. So I have a preface, an introduction, and then I have talk about giants. I talk about demons, spirits, and ghosts. I talk about Bigfoot. I talk about the aliens or the alien phenomena, but I don't think they're extraterrestrials from outer space. I've said that in my other videos. I talk about witchcraft, so there's a chapter on witches. I talk about vampires, werewolves, and skinwalkers, so that's the first 8 chapters. And then I also talk about some other concepts at the end of the book. So my final chapters are the underworld or Sheol. I talk about interdimensional portals, and I talk about what I call the first civilization, the civilization of the antediluvian world. And I talk about how there's remnants of this civilization all across the world. And a big thing that I talk about in this book is I try to emphasize very heavily when you read this book that it's not just about cryptids. It's not just about smelly creatures in the woods. There's the cryptids and the monsters in this book, but there's the other wacky stuff as well. And the other wacky stuff, and that's referring to some of these concepts that I talk about later in the book, like Sheol and portals and the first civilization. Those are the concepts that really bind all this together. And when you read this book, you immediately, from the preface and the introduction, realize that there is a civilization that existed before the flood of Noah that was very, very advanced in learning, and that this Genesis 6 narrative is about the Watchers. That's this group of fallen angels, or this group of Elohim, these spiritual beings. They came down to earth and they took for themselves human wives, and their children became the Nephilim, the giants of old. But there's more to the story than just the giants, and the giants became a menace upon the earth, and they ended up eating humans, and they consumed all the world's resources. But there's another key component of this story, that these watchers, these Elohim, these parents of the Nephilim, they were sharing their knowledge with humanity. And they were, how do I say this? They were literally usurping Yahweh's true worship, and they were being worshipped themselves as living gods upon the earth. The ultimate act of blasphemy in history. Now, when we think of pagan temples in history, we think of a Greek temple to Zeus, or a Roman temple would be to Jupiter, or in Mesopotamia, you would have worship to Baal, or whatever deities you want to think of, or in Scandinavia, you'd be worshiping Odin or Thor. And when you would walk into these temples in history, you'd have an idol. You'd have a statue made of stone or wood or metal, maybe bronze, and that's what you'd be worshiping in. But in the antediluvian era, it's different. You could have a living entity that looks like a human being, because they take physical form and they look like very handsome human being. And these Elohim were usurping Yahweh's worship and having humanity worship themselves as living gods upon the earth. And this is found not only in the Bible, but a lot of the details of this narrative are found in the extra biblical literature, such as the book of Enoch, First Enoch, and all this is talked about. And the other thing is that they shared their knowledge with humanity. Now, we need to remember that the angels shouted for joy, they sang for joy when the foundations of the earth were laid at the beginning of history. So their understanding of physics and the sciences and all of the branches of learning, all the natural branches of learning, they had great knowledge of things like farming, agriculture, mining, metallurgy, writing, but then what we would call the supernatural or the magical sciences, the occult sciences, the pharmakia, they had great knowledge of these things. And it's really interesting. The first witches in history were probably the wives of the Watchers. And so what happened was, when you take all these components of the story together, this is the inspiration for all of the mythologies across the world. You think of the Titans of Greek mythology. This goes back to the story of the Watchers that got imprisoned by Yahweh at the judgment of the flood. All of this history goes back to this time in history, and Noah is that last genetically pure human, him and his family, who get on that ark with the animals, and they survive God's judgment upon this upon this crazy world. And this is the story of the antediluvian world. And the other thing that they were doing was, in addition to producing this race of giants, the Nephilim, the Watchers were, the Book of Enoch says they were sinning against the various types of animals. So, in more modern day language, we would describe that as they were genetically tampering with these various types of animals, and they created what we would call chimeras or monsters. So, we think of the monsters of history, the centaurs and the minotaurs, the half horse, half man, or the half bull, a half man, the fawns, the half goat, half man, and it could be all sorts of other type of creatures that are not nothing like the depiction of Greek mythology. But these chimeras and monsters were created at this time in history, is in addition to the giants. So all of the cryptids in our world, in one shape or form, go back to this era in history. The Nephilim, the Watchers, and the Genesis 6 narrative really provide the explanation for all of these creatures in one way or another. Now, I explained in the book, all of these creatures are unique. It doesn't mean that everything is a Nephilim. It doesn't mean that everything is the same. They are distinct creatures that need to be defined and studied uniquely, but they all have their origins in this first epoch of history. And this is why when you study this topic of cryptids, it gets really exciting, because you see that it leads you into ancient history, it leads you into anthropology, it leads you to study mythology. Like I said, the inspiration for our mythology, like I use Greek mythology as an example a lot in this book. The Titans are really the Watchers that got imprisoned under the earth. And then I think the Olympian gods are kind of the fallen angels that kind of come on the scene after the Watchers. And those are the fallen angels that we're dealing with today. So there's different groups of these fallen angels in history. And in the book, you get explanation of Bigfoot, you get explanation of the Greys, what are typically called gray aliens, and I talk about all of the big events in this book. So the controversy surrounding the Patterson-Gimlin field, is it authentic or not authentic? I talk about that. I talk about the giant mounds of North America. I talk about the cover-up by groups like the Smithsonian or even the Vatican. But in the United States, primarily the Smithsonian and the academic and archaeological institutions in this country. And I talk about the Roswell event, 1947, which is an event that interests me because I went there. And then I talked about witchcraft, and then I get into the true monsters. I talked about, when I talked about demons, I defined all of that, and talk about things like identifying a demonized person, and talk about exorcism, and I talk about how the word demonized is superior to the word possessed. I talk about vampires, werewolves, witchcraft. I kind of go through a brief history of witchcraft and cover some of the main events, how the 15th century and the 16th centuries were really a hotbed for witch trials. The 1400s and 1500s in Europe and places like France or Germany, there was just an explosion of trials for witches, and I talk about all of that. I talk about the origin of the connection between witches and black cats in the book. When I wrote, I talked about vampires, and I talk about how that really goes back to the antediluvian world, and how they're really these demons that reanimate a corpse, and that's how it's defined by scholars, vampirologists like Montague Summers. And if you don't know who Montague Summers is, he's one of the most famous scholars of vampires in history. And if people who are into that very fringe material, they will know who Montague Summers is. I talk about his work a lot in the book, and I quote his work in the book. And when I wrote the chapter on werewolves, I was really surprised at some of the connections I found. So if you've been someone who's at a dogman sighting, or you're interested in werewolves, you're going to find a lot of material that I found really interesting in the book. And I'm not just saying that to sell copies, because I learned about how the Romans worshipped this wolf, and they had this festival of the wolf called the Lupercal or Lupercalia. And ironically, they celebrated that festival on February 14th, which is Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is this week. And I didn't intend to make a video talking about this on Valentine's Day. It just worked out that way. But this goes back to the myth of the founding of Rome. Romulus and Remus were nursed by this she-wolf that was called the Capitoline wolf. And there's this famous statue of this she-wolf nursing these infant twin brothers. If you Google Roman Capitoline wolf, this famous statue comes right up. But they had an entire festival dedicated to this wolf. And that Romans, when you read some of their ancient historians like Livy, they really did believe in this was a very agricultural society, so their herds, because there was a lot of shepherds and farmers who had flocks of livestock, and they would get attacked by normal wolves. But their historians say that they believed that these flocks would be attacked by full-on werewolves, and that was extremely fascinating. And there's also legends of werewolves in this region of ancient Greece called Arcadia, and Zeus was worshipped by this cult in this region of Greece, and they committed human sacrifice to Zeus in that region. And there were legends of werewolves. So in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, I was very, very surprised at all of the history that came out about this creature. Very, very fascinating. And I go into all of the detail describing this in the book. If you're interested in Dogman or werewolves, I would highly recommend the material just in that chapter alone, because it was one of the most interesting ones I wrote, and I enjoyed writing every single chapter. I enjoyed thoroughly writing this book because it was such an explosion of knowledge, and that's what really came out in the writing of this book. But yeah, with the Romans, that they had their own separate priesthood for the Lupercal, and that Roman soldiers would wear the wolf head above their garments. Not all Roman legionaries, but there would be specific ones who would wear this wolf skin above their armor or their helmets. And you can look that up on Google too. You know, there were certain Roman legionaries called the Velites that would wear this wolf skin on their head. And just the connections between these ancient societies like Greece and Rome and the werewolves was extremely fascinating. I talk about how werewolves have been very prominent in France, moving more forward into the medieval era, and then I go into all of the history of that. And then I talk about the skinwalkers in the American Southwest. And that was really interesting because I went to New Mexico. I went to the American Southwest this year, and I learned a lot about the Navajo and about their culture and about their religion. And it's interesting that they believe in this entity called the Evil One, and they believe that these skinwalkers, it's a form of black magic. And many Navajos won't even use the name skinwalker. They won't even talk about it because they believe it's very, very evil. But regardless, there are still certain shamans from that culture that practice this form of shape shifting called skinwalker. So I talk about all of this in the book, and I talk about Sheol, the underworld. I talk about the theology of that. Jesus going down into Sheol. This was believed by the early church. You see this theology in the Apostles' Creed. And then I talk about this idea of interdimensional portals, how there's legends of Bigfoot going through interdimensional portals. And then I talk about the first civilization. I talk about the megaliths, which is a subject that has really interested me for a long time, how there's megaliths in Egypt and Peru and all these places. So this book, even though it's a lot shorter than my last book, and I tried to make it easy to read, approachable, fun to read, I really wanted it where you can sit down over a day or two, soak in all the material. And my hope is it's very easy to read, but it's going to give you a lot to think about. So even though it's very breezy, it's gonna really make you think because it's gonna connect a lot of dots. There's a lot of good information packed into this 214 pages. So I really do think you're gonna get your bang for your buck. And this really is, guys, the best way to support this ministry. If there's anything you want to do in addition to prayer to support this ministry, I would encourage you to buy a copy of this book. A, because you're going to get a lot back yourself, a lot of great information, and you're going to also support what I'm doing, support the vision, because I really believe that God has called me to go down this direction of studying the Nephilim and the paranormal and turn this into a ministry that's going to help people. You know, and I never knew that I was going to go down this journey, but that's really where the title of this book comes from. It's called Apparently the Monsters Are Real, because you would think that a guy who wrote a book on cryptids, he's been obsessed with cryptids his whole life, and that's not the case. It's dawned on me, God has taught me over time, and I talk about this in the preface of the book right at the beginning, how this has been a journey for me to realize, like, holy smokes, this stuff is real. And one of the things I say a lot in this book is how I talk a lot in this book about how spiritual our world really is. And I have seen this with fresh eyes. There's all of the evil spirituality in this world, which a lot of this is covering. But I also talk about how there's the light in this world, and our world is so spiritual, and there's the distinction between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. It's not as big of a chasm as one would think. And there is a physical realm and a spiritual realm, and there is a veil between these two realms. And many of the brilliant men of history have understood this. If you read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as an example, and I talk about Tolkien's works a lot in this book because he had a very profound understanding of mythology and our prehistory, he illustrated this concept very well when he had those evil creatures called the ring wraiths, which we might want to call a cryptid or a monster. But these wraiths, they wear these cloaks because they were once physical beings, and they moved into the realm of shadows, the spiritual realm, and they're invisible to the naked eye, but they wear these cloaks so that they still are visible in the physical plane. And then when Frodo puts on the one ring, the ring of power, and he sees them as they really are, because he's in the spiritual plane, and he sees that they were kings and sorcerers of old, and he sees them as they once were. But they're wraiths. They are preternatural creatures. They exist on the physical plane and the spiritual plane. And I define preternatural in this book. And I could talk about this so much more, guys, but our world is more spiritual than we can imagine or even think about. And that's a phrase that I wrote in this book. Our world is so much more spiritual than we can possibly imagine, and that's what the paranormal is. It is these subjects that goes beyond the explanation of the material world, the natural world, and scientific explanation. That's what the paranormal is, and that's what this book is about. This book is about the spiritual, it is about the paranormal, it is about the preternatural. It is about those things that exist in the physical plane and the spiritual plane. And that's the best way that I'm able to describe these inexplicable realities. So that gives you a pretty good summary of what this book is about. I told you what's in the introduction. The introduction is all about this Genesis 6 narrative, laying the foundation for the rest of the book. And then I go through all the creatures I described, and then I get to the other wacky truths at the end, Sheol and portals and the first civilization, and I have a conclusion where I wrap it all up. And I also gave you a pretty good flavor of the book, the serious material in this book, and then also the more funny side of this book, because there is humor in this book, and I use references to literature in this book and references even to certain films or movies in this book. And it's a book that's supposed to be fun to read. It's a book that's supposed to be entertaining to read. It's a book that's supposed to be not too long. It's approachable for people to read. It's not a book for PhDs or scholars. It's a book for the common man. And that's what this book is about. And I tried very hard to take what I've learned from my last two books and put it into this book to give something that's really special for everybody. So that's the summary of this book, guys. And I'm really excited for it. I'm really glad that the Lord really gave me the help that I needed to write it. And I really do, and I don't mean this in a proud way, but I really do hope and believe that this is the best one I've written so far. So all that being said, I will leave the link. Ordering information it's on the Amazon store. You can buy a copy, and I would recommend you to buy a copy. And I also have a Kindle edition if you want to go that route. But it is available on Amazon. I will leave ordering information below, and that is what I have for you guys. Just put it back up to the camera one more time. So this book is apparently, there we go. Apparently the Monsters Are Real, a crash course in cryptids, monsters, and other wacky stuff by me, Joe Harper. So I hope you've enjoyed this summary of the book. This is what I have. This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless everybody. If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.